Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. You've been summoned to trial for heresy, even though you can't read. Now what happens? I remember that winter well, not for its cold, nor for the meager harvest, but because that was when they summoned me before the tribunal, brows furrowed and holding a parchment no one expected me to read. Me, the son of farmers, whose fingers knew damp soil better than any letter carved in wax. And yet there I was, in the dark hall of the priory, unshaven and with a light soul, not understanding what I had done to stir such suspicion. Perhaps it was the stubborn cough that gripped me during last Sunday's Mass. Or maybe it was the dream I told old Marta, the one where the bread of the Last Supper fell from the sky, warm and round, like when my mother still sang to me. The Inquisitor had squinty eyes and a habit of sniffing words before accepting them. He said my dreams revealed desire, and desire unblessed was the shortest path to the abyss. I didn't understand which abyss he meant. My life had always been surrounded by valleys and pastures, and the greatest danger I knew was the millocks when it got annoyed. Even so, they made me sit in that low chair where so many other peasants had already rested their bones, waiting for answers to questions they never knew how to ask. There was something sacred in the silence of that place, but also something deeply unfair, like when the church bell rings out of time. They say guilt has a smell, but in that room, what lingered was the scent of other people's fear. Those who came before me, who trembled when they heard their name written down by hands that knew Latin, but not compassion. The scribe looked at me like one might observe a strange animal. And when he asked if I prayed every night, I hesitated. Not out of doubt, but because sometimes, after long days in the field, my prayers fell asleep before I did. That was enough. They said those who don't pray fervently leave their hearts open to nighttime visits, and not the good kind. Someone said they saw me smiling alone once by the river. Smiling at inappropriate moments, the Inquisitor noted, as if recording a prophecy. I wanted to say I was smiling at the memory of my sister, who died young, and how, there among the willows, I could still feel her presence, light as mist. But how do you explain longing to someone who only believes in sin? I took a deep breath, remembering old Abel's advice, when there are no words, let silence speak for you. But know this. Not everyone hears what it says. In the cell they left me in, the cold curled through the stone cracks like a hungry cat. It was small, damp, and smelled of iron and forgotten time. There were names scratched into the walls, marks from fingernails, maybe prayers, maybe farewells. I tried to find solace in distant sounds, a crow, a chant, the jingle of a ring of keys. Sometimes, the faith I was taught as a child came back timidly, like a breeze that hesitates before crossing a window. Other times, it hid completely, and all that remained was the doubt, can a single accusation undo an entire life of quiet honesty? The next morning, they brought bread, hard, cold, and yet still bread. I ate slowly, as if the act itself might prove something, that I was human, that I felt hunger, that there was still life in me. The guard who watched me had ancient eyes, tired from seeing the same faces come and go, never to return. "Did you dream again?" he asked, not with mockery, but almost with pity. I nodded. I dreamed I had returned home. My mother was in the yard, roasting chestnuts, and the sweet smell drifted through the village like music. At the final hearing, they placed a crucifix before me and a lit candle. The Inquisitor spoke of temptation, of impure visions, of pacts that could hide even in the way one broke bread. I looked at the flame. It trembled like I did. They asked if I had ever seen the devil. I said no, But I thought of the winter that took my sister, of the fever that took my father, of the hunger that took hope from so many neighbors. If that wasn't the devil's hand, I didn't know what was. Of course, I said none of this. I simply bowed my head as I had been taught and asked for forgiveness, for everything and for nothing. When they finally let me go, absolved but not unscathed, I returned to the village with slow steps and a new shadow behind me. It wasn't fear, it was knowing. Knowing that all it took was a whisper, a misread fever, a distracted glance during Mass for everything to fall apart. I began to pray more, yes, but in silence. I dreamed less, or at least I stopped sharing. And bread, oh bread. I never broke it again without first thinking how even its dream could be considered a sin by some. And that is where my memory rests tonight. In the whisper of the candle before it goes out, in the crumb tucked in a pocket, in the echo of a question that never deserved an answer. For in those times, full of prayers and fears, the greatest terror was not hell itself, but the certainty that it could begin with a stumble on the wrong word, a silence misread, a dream about bread. But in that frozen cell, in that room full of judging eyes, I also learned something else: resistance. Not the kind of the brave or the saints, but of the simple. People like me who, without knowing how to read, learned to navigate the world's dangers with what they had: caution, memory, and the discreet warmth of hope. Because even in times of inquisition, there were still gestures that slipped past suspicion. A kind look, a piece of firewood left by the door, and the most sacred of all, the right to keep dreaming in silence. What it was like, trying to sleep in a medieval village with 12 people, 4 chickens, and a storm indoors. It rained that night, one of those persistent rains that don't announce anything dramatic. They just arrive like an uninvited guest and refuse to leave. Outside, the wind slapped the trees with a rude sort of familiarity, making the thatched roof sigh and creak like an old man trying to remember a forgotten tale. Inside the house, if that patchwork of wood, mud, and hope could even be called a house, there were 12 human souls, 4 disgruntled chickens, and 1 cat who, as always, acted like none of it had anything to do with him. I remember clearly the sound of water dripping through the roof's cracks, landing with mathematical precision into an empty milk bucket someone had left in the corner. That bucket was our clock that night. Each plop echoed like the slow beat of a heart. There were bodies everywhere. Siblings, aunts, some cousin whose name had long been forgotten, even old Irwin, who snored like he was wrestling a bear in his sleep. Someone had hung dried herbs from the beams to ward off evil spirits, though I suspected it only encouraged the chickens to roost higher. One of them, the boldest, we called her Branca, even though her feathers had the exact color of a rag forgotten in the mud, insisted on sleeping on my uncle's head. Every time he turned, she let out a raspy squawk, like an old woman scolding from her favorite bench in the square. He, half asleep, would mutter curses at the bird, the roof, the rain, and at one point even the king, which earned a few stifled chuckles from the rest of us. That's how stormy nights went, full of noise, misplaced elbows, and the occasional tantrum from a house pet. In the dim light, the only glow came from the fire still holding on, crackling weakly, and casting trembling shadows on the cracked clay walls. Someone, probably my older cousin, started telling a story. One of those old ones, about enchanted wolves and foolish kings that we all knew by heart but pretended not to, just to hear it again. The words flowed softly, carried by the popping wood, and for a brief moment we forgot about our cold feet, the damp straw beneath us, and the world beyond. Even the cat, always aloof, stopped grooming and tilted his ears to listen. The story went on, and gradually the voices faded, not from boredom, but because sleep was beginning to weigh on everyone's eyelids. The fire's warmth, though modest, spread gently, like the hug of an old blanket. The chickens, overcome by the tale or exhaustion, settled into improbable corners, One even cozied up inside a shoe that clearly didn't belong to her. Uncle Irwin's snore became a constant, like the distant growl of thunder that no longer scares, only soothes. Outside, the wind still whistled through the poorly latched door, bringing with it the damp breath of wet earth and timber. And even with the persistent dripping, the elbows pressing into our sides and the straw scratching our skin beneath the blankets, there was a strange comfort there, a sense of belonging. Sleep was never easy, but it was shared. A ritual woven between heavy breaths, crossed feet, and the sleepy murmurs of someone still trying to continue a conversation from hours before. There was also the gentle sound of rain tapping on the thatch roof, like ancient fingers drumming forgotten stories. Now and then, a rebellious drop would break course and fall on someone, earning a grunt or a muffled laugh. I, by luck, was protected that night by a blanket inherited from my grandmother, thick, scratchy, and smelling faintly of hay and elderflower. It was my little fortress against the cold and the stray feathers that flew whenever a chicken shifted for no reason. And then, in those rare moments when the noise quieted, you could hear something else. The house's presence. The creaking wood, the sigh of stones in the stove, the groaning of the roof, as if it too were dreaming. It was in those moments, between a snore, a drip, a shuffling paw, that sleep truly found us. Not as a plunge, but as a gentle mist slipping between bodies and curling up beside us, respectful of the chaos and the disordered symphony of our coexistence. No one slept deeply, but no one seemed to mind. It was sleep in layers, where dreams came in fragments, interrupted by a branch knocking on the window or someone unconsciously tugging the blanket away. Still, there was something enchanting about that imbalance, as if the gods of rest understood that in that crooked house, perfect silence was not only impossible, but perhaps not even welcome. At some point during the night, I was awakened by a brief laugh, one of those that escape from a funny dream and make the dreamer turn with a smile. It was my younger sister, curled up beside our grandmother, clutching a doll made of cloth and straw. Her fingers gripped the toy with the same determination the adults held onto their small certainties. For a moment, I thought of sitting up, maybe stirring the fire or checking if the bucket had overflowed. But I changed my mind. The night, with all its imperfections and sounds, was strangely perfect just as it was. I closed my eyes again and let the house wrap around me once more. The steady rhythm of the rain blended with the sighs of the dying fire, while the scent of burned wood and damp earth filled every corner of the air. It was like falling asleep inside an old song, one without a chorus, but with familiar verses that repeat only to make sure we don't lose ourselves in the dark. The night went on, and the world outside felt as distant as a castle in a dream. Within that cramped space, bodies scattered like mismatched pieces of a puzzle, we found something no feudal lord or warrior could ever take from us. Human warmth, shared stories, and the strange certainty that, even under a dripping roof and with chickens on our pillows, we were safe. When the first pale tones of morning began to filter through the cracks in the wall, the house slowly stirred. Not in a hurry, but like an old man opening his eyes reluctantly, dreading the day to come. The fire had turned to timid embers, and the scent of dew dripping from the roof tiles mingled with the coarse perfume of warmed hay. The chickens were already restless, flapping their wings impatiently, ready to reclaim their dominion over the dirt floor. We woke together just as we had fallen asleep, tangled, crumpled, smiling in that dazed, grateful sort of way. There was something beautiful in that disorder, a noisy, uncomfortable night, and yet profoundly ours. And as we stretched between whispered jokes and careful steps to avoid feathers or sleeping cousins, I realized that somewhere between the leaks and the snores, we had found rest. Not the silence of nobles, but the comfort of the humble. rare and real. You were born the sixth son of a peasant. Congratulations. Your career begins now. I was born on a morning of calm wind, with the sweet scent of freshly cut hay drifting into our small house of wood and mud. My older brothers say I was the sixth, though they often seem to forget my place in the line, perhaps out of convenience or just exhaustion. Our father, a man with broad hands and long silences, simply nodded when they placed me in his arms. My mother, on the other hand, sighed like someone finishing a difficult, necessary task. In those days, every new child was either a promise or a problem. Maybe both. As a child, I slept somewhere between the bedroom and the stable, wrapped in a blanket that had once been someone's tunic. The hearth's warmth was shared with a nameless cat and at times a goat that believed she owned the place. I remember the roof dripping on rainy nights and that my pillow was a linen sack stuffed with straw, more noise than comfort. Being the sixth son meant learning early how to take up little space and even less food, but also how to listen, to observe, and to disappear before someone remembered there was still something to be done. That's how my career began, with light footsteps and wide open eyes. Around the age of 7, I discovered that too many questions led to extra chores, so I learned to listen in silence, especially at night, when my brothers told stories of monsters roaming the fields or of a distant cousin who'd been chosen to be an altar boy and was never quite the same again. Sometimes I dreamed of being chosen for something too. Not something grand, of course, but maybe something useful. A novice in a distant monastery, perhaps. Or a tired knight's page. Or at the very least, the mascot of some loud band of merchants who wandered the roads like they owned the world. My first chance to escape routine came when a passing friar asked for help carrying books. I'd never touched one before, and I accepted at once. The volumes smelled of mold and secrets. The friar gave me a dried apple and said I had light hands and quiet steps. Traits, he added, much appreciated among his kind. I wasn't sure if he was offering me a future or describing a thief. Still, that apple, though shriveled, was the finest gift I had ever received. For a whole week I dreamed of cold cloisters, arched windows, and a silence that didn't mean hunger. Of course, I didn't go with him. My father said the cows were sick, and someone needed to learn how to handle salt to preserve the milk. That's how I began working with a half-deaf, fully grumpy uncle who taught me more about patience than he did about dairy. The days were long and the nights were damp. Sometimes I wished I were the mouse behind the shelves, free to escape through some crack in the wall, but the work taught me to wait and to listen, and most of all, to vanish when the shouting came louder than necessary. It wasn't until I was 12 that I finally left the village. A group of merchants passed through, selling bells, questionable spices, and even more questionable promises. One of them, a red-haired man with a thunderous voice and boots that smelled of honey and mud, called me over to carry crates. "You've got fine hands. Don't look like the complaining type," he said. And I didn't complain. The next day, with a quick blessing from my mother and my father's blank stare, I left with them. In the wagon, wedged between barrels and fabric, I learned that being a merchant's mascot meant more than just hauling things. It meant entertaining, listening to stories, learning accents, and, when needed, lying with a touch of grace. We slept under open skies, coats as mattresses, and the stars our only shield against the damp. Sometimes we stopped in villages smaller than mine, and it struck me how, even while traveling, I always seemed to return to where I'd started. But there was something new now. I saw maps, heard names of cities that sounded like spells, Bruges, Cordoba, Constantinople, and learned about things I'd never imagined, like sweets made from petals and glass that let colored light through. One of the older merchants, quiet and grey-eyed, gave me a worn coin and told me it would only work if I never spent it. I still carry it today, though I never did figure out what it was truly worth. One night, Near a stone bridge, I heard the older men arguing about the route. They mentioned bandits, taxes, and a certain calculated risk. I pretended to sleep, but I remembered every word. I learned that in this world, it wasn't strength that decided everything, but the ability to say yes with your eyes and no with your feet. When the dangers came, and they did, I already knew how to shrink beneath the cart, how to silence my breath and let time pass. And when one of the younger men was wounded in an ambush, it was I who found the nearest village and brought help. From that day on, they stopped calling me the mascot. I became the boy with watcher's eyes. Over time, I learned to read signs. The way the wind changed near a city's walls, the sound of wheels on fine gravel, the silence that came before rain. The merchants began to trust me with more important tasks, negotiating with distracted gatekeepers, exchanging coins in crowded markets, guarding the horses when others were too busy drinking or lying. It wasn't much, but it was mine. An identity not tied to my father's name or birth order, but to what I had learned to do with the little I'd been given. In a coastal city whose name I've since forgotten, a man in a blue robe with ember-like eyes watched me for days. When he finally spoke, he said there were convents that welcome boys with good memory and steady hands. I thought of the friar's apple so many years ago and the scent of old parchment. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I slept beneath a wagon's canopy, cradled by voices in languages I didn't understand. I didn't dream of cloisters or scrolls, but of roads. And I realized then that my path might not lead to a monastery or a manor, but to all the places my brothers never dared to imagine. Years passed, and I stopped counting the summers. My face, once a boy's, had come to mirror that of the red-haired man who once took me in. Weathered by sun, nights slept under the open sky, and words spoken through half-smiles. I was no longer the sixth son of a peasant. I was someone who, in taverns and fairs, was greeted with nods of recognition and requests to tell stories, and I told them. About the time a Greek merchant taught me to read numbers as if they were spells, or when I helped settle a dispute between two drunk men throwing dice made of carved stone. My voice had become my livelihood and my memories, valuable wares. Now when the wind blows and the fire crackles, I find myself returning to that first night away from home, the dried apple, the books that smelled of mystery, the silence shared between the friar and me. I didn't become a monk, nor a knight, nor a hero from any tale, but I found a path that made room for my doubts, my silences, even my fears. And when children approach me at some crossroads, curious, asking where I come from, I always answer with a smile. After fifth place in line, the world suddenly becomes much wider than it seems, and that, I've learned, is more than enough. Your only pair of shoes tore at the start of winter. I remember well the day I lost my shoes. Not because it was dramatic, no storms, no bandits chasing me through the woods, but because of the cruel simplicity of it. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and frost was already painting little crystal flowers on the leaves of the old oak near the garden wall. I took just a few steps over the hardened ground, and I heard the sound. Crack. The leather, far too worn, gave way at the sole. My only pair of shoes torn, and winter, of course, had barely begun. They were a simple pair, made by my uncle from scraps he swore came from a knight's saddle. I doubted it, but liked the story anyway. The stitches had been loose for weeks, and the sole hung like the tongue of a tired dog, but they were mine. And even as the cold bit at my toes and the mud crept through the cracks, I wore them with the dignity of a count. Now without them, every step became a careful negotiation between thorns, stones, and the kind of mud that never forgets a bare foot. I started improvising, like so many before me. First, old rags. Then a strip of canvas, what my grandmother used to call the curtains no one wanted anymore. I wrapped my feet carefully, tying them with twisted linen cords, trying to forget it wasn't leather. And then came the frozen mornings, when the dew turned everything to glass, and one misstep was enough to make my toes scream. But I walked anyway. There was work to do, and some promises aren't kept with comfort, but with courage. The road to the market was the worst. Not because it was long, but because it was made of stone and bad intentions. Every pebble seemed to choose me by name. I walked slowly, dodging when I could, laughing inwardly when a cat stared at me from a window as if to say, "Now that's stubbornness." Sometimes, halfway through the path, I'd stop beneath a willow to rub my feet and think. They said new shoes could be ordered in the big city, with double soles and bronze buckles. But by then, the question wasn't where to buy, but with what to pay. It was during one of those quiet pauses, sitting on a rock still damp with morning mist, that an old honey seller found me. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at my feet wrapped in cloth and let out a low whistle, like someone watching a roof about to collapse. Then he pulled a strip of cured leather from his pocket, narrow, stained but strong, and offered it to me with a small, almost embarrassed gesture. "Won't cover both," he murmured, "but it's a start." And he left before I could even thank him. I stayed there, holding that strip like it was a map to somewhere better. I walked home with an unexpected warmth in my toes, even if they were still cold. That night by the hearthlight, I worked with a bent needle and hemp thread, sewing the way my grandmother had taught me, patience before speed, care before force. My hands trembled, but not from the cold, perhaps from hope. The leather wasn't much, but it was enough to patch the most worn part of the shoe. It wasn't pretty nor sturdy, but it was enough. And that week, I walked back to the market, slowly, but with a smile hidden beneath my scarf. At the market, no one noticed my patched shoes, and that was a relief. Sometimes the greatest gift in the world is to go unnoticed. Among stalls of wilted vegetables and coarse cloth, I found the honey seller again, now selling golden jars that gleamed even under a grey sky. I approached him carefully, not to thank him, I still didn't know how, but to ask if he needed help with anything. He looked at me with calm eyes and said simply, "I need someone who knows how to walk slowly." And just like that, our small partnership began. I worked with him through the rest of winter. Carried baskets, arranged the jars, shooed away the bolder bees. In return, he taught me curious things. How to tell good honey by its sound. How to wrap your fingers in warm wax on cold mornings. How to wait for the right timing in all things. And little by little, with the coins I quietly stashed beneath my straw mattress, I bought new leather. Not much, just enough for a real pair of shoes. It wasn't just a purchase, it was a right. A new beginning, step by step. I remember the morning I put on those new shoes for the first time. The leather still creaked timidly, as if it were getting used to me, and I to it. I left before sunrise, just to hear the sound of soles over the frozen path. It was a small sound, almost imperceptible, but my heart heard it loud. Each step carried weight, yes, but also purpose. I was no longer the boy who snuck between puddles and thorns. Now I stepped forward with certainty, as someone who belonged to the road beneath him. The honey seller saw me approach with the new shoes, and nodded without smiling, though his eyes said everything. "They walk on their own now," he said, nodding to my feet. "But don't forget the time they needed patches and silence." That stayed with me, because the hardest paths don't leave us when they end. They linger softly in memory's folds, like the outline of a scar that no longer hurts. And that day, selling golden jars beside him, with warm and steady feet, I felt something rare and precious. Belonging. Winter said its goodbyes slowly, the way old friends do, reluctantly, and with a touch of tenderness. The frosts grew less fierce, The mornings came sprinkled with birdsong, and the muddy paths seemed less threatening with the sun slipping through the leaves. The shoes, which once felt like a distant luxury, had become a part of me. I no longer noticed them with each step, and that's when I knew they were good. Not because they were new, but because they had been earned. Sometimes I still think of the first pair, all torn and tilted like an old boat. I kept a piece of it, small, and carefully folded inside a faded handkerchief. Not out of attachment, but out of gratitude. Because it was that tear that led me down paths I would never have chosen on my own. The stone bench beneath the willow, the quiet gesture of the old man, the nights spent sowing with hope. And more than anything, the quiet certainty that even the coldest winters know how to teach, with wind, with mud, and sometimes with a new pair of shoes. The day the village priest forgot his sermon and improvised with tales of a drunken saint. It was one of those Sundays when the air felt especially quiet, as if even the village bells were hesitant to ring. Morning mist still clung to the thatched rooftops, and the wooden pews of the little stone church were already filled, with sharp-eyed old women, peasants in damp boots, and children dozing on their mothers' laps. As always, everyone awaited the sermon with a mix of resignation and reverent boredom, lulled by the scent of polished wood, incense, and wet wool. The priest was known for his monotonous voice and strict doctrine, the kind of man who didn't smile, not even while baptizing a baby. But that day, something slipped out of place. When he climbed into the pulpit, cassock slightly crooked and cheeks faintly flushed, a detail only the most observant caught, he paused. He blinked twice, cleared his throat like shaking off a stubborn thought, and instead of opening the Bible, spread his arms like a storyteller by a fire. "Today," he said, his voice livelier than ever, "let us talk about St. Arnulf and the miracle of the bottomless barrel." A murmur passed through the pews, not of disapproval, but of anticipation. Because instead of warnings about hellfire and repentance, what followed that morning was something else entirely, a performance, and no one dared interrupt. He spoke of St. Arnulf, patron saint of brewers, and, according to the priest, a man of faith but also of thirst, who once spared his village from a plague by convincing the people to drink beer instead of water. A miracle, he said, eyes twinkling, or just good sense. The congregation, long accustomed to fire and brimstone homilies, shifted in their seats, some in surprise, others stifling laughter. A child let out a shrill giggle at the word drunk and was promptly elbowed by his mother, who, despite the scolding, wore a hidden smile. With each new anecdote, the saint who blessed barrels, fasted on bread and hops, or once converted a band of soldiers with just 3 mugs, the priest's tone wavered between theatrical and conspiratorial. He gestured enthusiastically, mimicked accents, and even raised an imaginary glass in a symbolic toast. It was as if he had completely forgotten where he was, or perhaps, for the first time, remembered. And there they all were, gathered not out of fear, but drawn by a simple, unexpected joy. It felt, somehow, magical. At the back of the church, Donna Brigida, who hadn't missed a mass in 50 years, watched with arched eyebrows but said nothing. Even the shy sacristan, who usually fretted over bell tones, stood frozen, wide-eyed, clutching a crooked candlestick like an audience member at a traveling play. The sermon had become an improvised play, tragicomic, irreverent, and deeply human. Each tale of the saint touched something personal in those gathered, the exhaustion of failed harvests, the longing for lighter times, or simply the desire to laugh freely just once. When the final bell rang, slightly late as the sacristan had forgotten to breathe, no one stood up right away. The priest, breathless and with his stole slipping off one shoulder, made the sign of the cross with a reclaimed solemnity, as if returning from a long journey. "Go in peace," he said, still smiling, "and if you drink, "Let it be with gratitude." Some coughed, others murmured an uncertain amen, but many simply chuckled quietly. Outside, the sky remained overcast, but there was a different kind of warmth lingering on the church steps, a gentle confusion, like a half-funny dream no one was sure whether to share or keep to themselves. That Sunday, there was no talk of sin, punishment, or apocalypse. Instead, they spoke of miraculous barrels, saints who stumbled in their sandals, and how even the most devout men have days of weariness and thirst. Throughout the afternoon, as villagers returned to their tasks, mending fences, gathering greens, heating the day's soup, the stories from the sermon slipped into whispers and muffled laughter. Some claimed the priest had finally gone mad. Others said he'd been touched by divine inspiration, though a few mentioned a wineskin opened by mistake the night before. The truth, as always, drifted off into the cracks of time. And so that morning's Mass became the most memorable of all, not for its liturgy, but for its charming strangeness. For weeks, maybe months, neighbors would retell the tales of St. Arnulf as if they were inherited folklore, always adding a new flourish or a fresh gesture from the priest. No one dared scold him, not even the bishop, who, rumor had it, was a quiet admirer of a well-poured ale. That day went into the village calendar, not as a scandal, but as a pause. A moment when faith, through a happy accident, mingled with laughter and tenderness, and perhaps some thought that was the truest miracle of all. In the weeks that followed, something curious happened. The priest returned to his usual sermons, well-rehearsed psalms, moderate warnings, dramatic pauses in all the right places, but the congregation listened with a new glint in their eyes. Not that they expected another performance. That moment had been one of a kind, like a shooting star across a winter sky. But deep in each listener's heart lingered the memory of that morning when the church filled with laughter and stories instead of penance. And quietly, people began to carry more kindness into their daily lives, a generous share from the wood-fired oven, a warmer greeting at the market, a whispered song on the walk back from the well. As for the priest, no one ever knew for sure whether he had truly forgotten the sermon or planned the whole thing. He never spoke of it again, not from the pulpit, nor in confessionals. But sometimes, during Vespers, when the stained glass cast crooked halos on the stone floor, one might catch him straightening the altar books with a faint smile on his lips, the kind of smile worn by someone who knows the limits of solemnity, and understands deep down that even saints deserve a sip of joy now and then.